So how many people in the room come from a testing background? So some, great. If I were to give this talk at a testing conference, most of you would come from a testing background. And if your view of automation was probably driven by messaging that test tool vendors started 25, 30 years ago, and very much a legacy approach, and as we'll see, very much counterintuitive to what we're trying to accomplish with DevOps. So from that sense, I think we're all in a good position to start thinking about how we can implement effective test automation in DevOps. So that's a good thing. Real quickly about me, CTO of Utopia Solutions. We're a QA and testing focused services firm based in Chicago. I've been doing this for quite a while, most of that time focused on test automation. And certainly my view of test automation has evolved and changed over the years, mostly by the school of hard knocks. But one thing that's been constant is striving to implement automation the right way. And the right way is completely unique to whatever your organization is, whatever your challenges are. It's not a tool, it's not a framework, it's not some approach that you've Googled, it's what makes sense for you. So we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. Quickly run through an agenda, spend just a brief moment on the importance of test automation to DevOps, and then talk about some of the common obstacles that affect test automation, not just in a DevOps environment, but really any environment. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about what we can do to overcome those obstacles and not be part of what some people estimate as the 80% of automation implementations that fail. And that's a pretty staggering statistic, but unfortunately a pretty well accepted one as well. And then we'll have a brief wrap up. So the goal behind DevOps is to deliver value to our clients as efficiently as possible. And I'm sure we could have a religious debate about what the real objectives and what DevOps really is. But whatever our objectives are, we need fast, accurate, actionable feedback from our testing activities if we're going to achieve those goals. Again, I came from a background of the big legacy testing centers of excellence, and we developed these huge automated test suites that took sometimes days to execute. So if you think about a lot of the information out in the world, if you were going to learn about automation, that's where that's coming from. And trying to reconcile that with what we're trying to accomplish with DevOps just doesn't work. One point I want to make, I have a longer version of this talk where I spend a lot of time talking about what testing is in DevOps. But there's one thing that I want to point out from that, and that's that automation is not automating the testing. So if we can understand that and agree on that testing is critical thinking and experimentation and investigation to identify risks in your product, and that can't be automated, I think we're all in a good common ground. Automation is applying automation principles to those testing activities where appropriate, where it makes sense, but it's not automating the testing. And again, this is born out of a lot of messaging that started well over 20, 25 years ago about how this tool is going to solve all your testing problems, or that tool is going to solve all your testing problems. And I found out many times over the hard way that just isn't the case. There's no silver bullet. All right, so I think a good way to point out the importance of automation in DevOps, if we look at an excerpt from the DevOps handbook that talks about required capabilities for continuous integration, right? And point number one is a comprehensive set of reliable automated tests. And if we have a culture that stops the production line when those tests fail, we also need those tests to be reliable. And we'll talk quite a bit about how we can approach that from a reliability standpoint. Another way, real quick, to look at the importance of DevOps, this is from the last year's State of DevOps report, is the level of automation, not just in testing, but all activities in your pipeline. Right? We can see that elite high performers have a much higher degree of automation than their lower performing counterparts. So if we take nothing else from those last couple slides, we have to have effective automation if we're going to succeed. Let's take a quick look at some common obstacles that I see these over and over again with organizations, again, not just in DevOps, but trying to implement automation in general. First is too much, and sometimes even not enough automation in their testing. But what too much looks like is someone talking about the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of test cases that they execute every build, every day, every week. But if you dig in, what you end up finding is no one really understands the value that those test cases deliver, right? They may all be green in terms of the results, in terms of passing information through the pipeline, but no one really knows if there's value. And they tend to grow over time, and the feedback loop that those test suites give you gets longer and longer and longer, and eventually probably collapses under its own weight. All right, so as we'll talk about, we really need to focus on the high value tests. And we need to have some techniques to figure out which ones those are. Automating the wrong tests. Tests that, again, add no value. Tests that can't reliably be automated for whatever reason. This is a big one, focusing on UI tests. And again, if you came from my background, that's where test automation started. Commercial tool vendors with UI-based tools telling you that they're going to solve all your problems. So this became our hammer, and every automation opportunity looked like a nail to us. But as we know now, and we'll talk about some techniques, there's other levels that we can execute testing at. API, service level, certainly at a unit level. And this is a huge one. We'll spend a lot of time talking about this, unstable test environments and data. Probably the biggest issue that you're going to face in terms of getting your tests to be repeatable and execute reliably when you need them. Again, if we're in a 6-month waterfall cycle, maybe I have time to maintain my tests and get them working. But in a DevOps pipeline where these tests are being kicked off automatically by some event, I don't have that luxury anymore. And finally, we're not going to spend really any time on this, but I see organizations not treating their automated test code as code. Right? So if we're going to rely on these tests, at least in part, to assess the quality of our product, we should at least treat it with the same care that we're treating the code of the product itself. And again, I think a lot of this is getting better as more people with I think more varied backgrounds get into creating automated testing solutions. But coming out of my background, we didn't version control our tests or our code. The IDEs we used were terrible. The idea of assessing your code, it was so far from our, we didn't even know that stuff existed. All right, so what can we do about it? I'd like to talk about what I call the 3 pillars of effective test automation: scope, approach, and method, or the way you go about automating those tests, and finally, environment and data management. Certainly, there's some things you need to think about. You need to know what you're doing. You need to be able to create effective tests, right? The craft of software testing doesn't go away just because you've automated your test. But if you get these things right, you're pointed in the right direction, all right? Even if you do a good job of understanding the craft of software testing and create good test cases, if you don't get this right, it's not going to matter. So let's talk about scope and approach together. I think they go hand in hand pretty well. First, let's take a look at typical delivery pipeline. As we go down that pipeline, hopefully anyway, we're getting increased confidence in our build's readiness to be deployed. Right? And similarly, those environments likely are getting more production-like, certainly more complex. The tests that we're executing in those environments are likely getting more complex, taking longer to execute. And that flies a little bit in the face of the need for our fast feedback. Right? As those tests get longer, it becomes more difficult for us to get faster feedback, and therefore more important to make sure that we're only automating the tests that make sense. We're only including the tests that are adding value to the pipeline, because we're in this constant battle of risk assessment and coverage versus the need to get fast feedback. So how do we do that? Well, the first technique that we typically use when we're thinking about testing and automation in our pipeline, or really any type of development cycle, is to look at what I call the test suite canvas. And I can't take credit. Katrina Clokey first came up with this concept. And she actually, by the way, has a great book on testing in DevOps. If you want to understand what software testing means in the context of DevOps, she does a great job in her book. The test suite canvas gives us a full look at what the universe of testing we're going to add to our pipeline is. And we do this as a group. And this isn't a 2 days of planning type thing. This is a couple hours, a whole team effort, not just an automation engineer in a vacuum, thinking about the test suites that need to be part of this pipeline. So I'll go through these quickly. Purpose, obviously. What risk is this test suite going to mitigate for us? All right, if we can't come up with a purpose, we shouldn't be creating it. But I see a lot of that, by the way. I see a lot of automation for the sake of automating because they can. Right? They have a tool. Dependencies and constraints. If I'm going to implement this test suite, there's some things that are going to have to be in place to enable it. There may be some obstacles that are already there, like we don't have clean, fresh test environments to execute in, or some other things that I need to deal with before this test suite can be effective. Certainly understanding where the test suite is going to exist within the pipeline, how often it's going to be executed, what are the triggers for execution are important. And these are all things we need to think about before we start building them. Because what often happens is we build an automated test suite and then we try to kind of cobble it in wherever we think it should fit. And that leads to some other issues. Environment and data. We'll spend a lot of time talking about this. Where is this test suite going to execute? How are we going to manage the data so we can ensure that the test suite can be executed on demand? Who's going to own the test suite? If something fails, we turn the build red, who's responsible for looking into why and fixing it, which leads to maintainability. Not so much, certainly, I guess, the maintenance of the test suite itself in terms of effort, but what if we have to hand it off? What do we need minimally in place to make that as painless as possible? And then last, but certainly not least, is the effectiveness. Right? We built this test suite for a reason. We expected some value out of it. How are we going to make sure that we continue to get that value? So this is really just a metrics and a measurement question. But again, a lot of times I see test automation be a fire and forget solution. Well, I've got the test suite. It's executing. If something breaks, I'll fix it. But other than that, I'm not thinking about it. I'm just executing it over and over and over again. And over time, it's going to continue to lose value. I guarantee it. The application's going to change. You're going to miss opportunities to do things more effectively, more efficiently. And pretty soon it will just drop off the radar and it'll be ignored. Right, so once I understand the universe of things that I want to test, right, by going through the test suite canvas process, we'll typically put those one row per test suite on a spreadsheet so we can see them, in kind of the whole universe at once. There may be some common dependencies, some common constraints. I can kill multiple birds with one stone, and see where my value is, where maybe if I've got some effort or some budget constraints, some things that maybe aren't as important to me. But once I've narrowed it down to the test suites that I want, I'll map them to the pipeline so I can visually get an idea of where my automation is going to live. And are there instances where it must be executed sequentially? Are there some things I can do possibly in parallel? So test suites are half the battle. That's an important part of it. We want the whole team to understand where our automated checks are going to be within our pipeline. What risks are we mitigating with those automated checks? But then the next level of detail, and this is more of a whatever you call your automation engineer type role, and that's determining what tests should be within those test suites. And I like to use an acronym, FITR, as developed by Bas Dijkstra. He's an automation engineer out of the Netherlands, and he does a lot of work in Agile and DevOps environments. And it stands for focused, informative, trustworthy, and repeatable. The idea of focused is that we're executing tests as close to the code as we possibly can, right? And so an example, a bad example may be if I have to test a tax calculation in a service, right? And maybe I designed a test because I came up with it manually, that I'm going to verify that tax calculation by comparing a total field on an invoice. Right, not a great test, but bear with me. If I execute that test and it passes, I'm probably okay. If by chance, maybe it happened to match and the tax value was wrong, but some other value compensated. But more than likely, I'm okay. But if that fails, now I've got a problem. Why did it fail? Did it fail because there's a problem with the tax calculation, or because some of the data for some of the products I have in that invoice was different, or dozens of other reasons? And now I have a long, prolonged analysis to try to figure out what happened. And again, that's counterproductive to our need for fast feedback. If our tests are focused, they probably go a good part of the way to be informative. But I think we can probably do more. A lot of times, your tests are going to be written in code. So someone looking at that code should understand the intent of the test. And if you created tests just because you can, or automated tests just because you can, a lot of times the intent isn't there. You see steps and you see data, but you really don't have an understanding of why those steps are being executed. So we want to make them, when we create the test, we want to make them informative. It may just be comments, right? It also may be the way you construct the test, the way you construct your framework to allow you to create tests a little bit more intuitively. On the output side, that's just as important, right? A common issue in automated testing, especially if you're doing it at the UI level, is you can't find an element on in the browser, right? Very commonly. Flaky test happens all the time. What I'll often see, though, when that happens, is a stack trace. And that may be helpful to some of us, but independent of who we are and what our technical background is, if I knew the element I was looking for, if I knew the locator that I was using to find it, and I probably had a screenshot, 9 times out of 10, that's more than enough information to point me in the right direction so I could find out very quickly what the cause was. Did someone change the properties of that element? Is it a synchronization issue where that element just wasn't there yet? Right? If I had those 3 pieces, I could figure that out pretty quickly. Without that, though, again, I've got this analysis period that's lengthening my feedback loop. Next is trustworthy. You need your test to give you accurate feedback. If you get a lot of false positives, or worse, false negatives in your results, you're going to lose your privilege of being part of that pipeline. Or you're just going to be ignored, and really either outcome is not what you're looking for. And we'll talk about how we can make our tests trustworthy. Finally, repeatable, right? The days of the automation engineer pressing play on his or her desktop and watching the test run for hours, days, whatever the case may be, they're over. These test suites are being executed automatically by some trigger that the author of the test suite has no control over. They have to be able to be executed on demand. In order to get to that, it probably means that you've taken care of business from a test environment and a test data perspective. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about those topics next. Okay. You find it in the World Quality Report. You can find it pretty much anywhere. Test environment data are the biggest obstacles that you're going to run into with test automation, hands down. And the symptom typically is, well, it worked on my machine. Right? You've got some downstream test running, turns the build red, and whoever created that test, well, it works on my desktop. Well, a completely different environment, more than likely, with completely different data. All right, so we're going to talk next about some techniques at a test environment level and a test data level that we can hopefully remove that term, that phrase from our vernacular. So let's start by looking at the spectrum of test environments and data. On the left here, we have static, shared, stale. Talking to this audience, hopefully not too many of us are over there, right? That doesn't really fly with what we're trying to accomplish with DevOps. But if you are near this side of the spectrum, we've got some automation issues that we need to deal with, right? We have data staleness, we're gonna have scheduling conflicts. It's likely not production-like, either in shape or size, right? And it's a very automation-averse type situation, right? We're gonna have unreliable execution because we don't quite know what the data is there. Is the system expecting the data that we're inputting? Is it giving us the right response? To get around that, maybe I've got a whole big, long, complex data setup cycle, or maybe I've got to clean up the data after I execute. And probably a lot of false positives, right? Again, that leads to our prolonged analysis, which flies in the face of our need for fast, accurate feedback. If we're on the other end, though, and hopefully, again, from a DevOps perspective, we're closer to the right side of this diagram, we have dynamic, dedicated, fresh environments, and they're much more automation friendly. We can, if we want, create clean environments on demand, right? We've got infrastructure as code, we've got cloud technologies that allow us to do that. Because we're now treating our environments more like cattle and not pets, right? We can dedicate environments to a specific purpose if we want. If we need them to be production-like, they can be production-like. But at a minimum, we can all be working in like configured environments. And again, we're eliminating the well, it worked on my machine problem. And since we're creating environments on demand, we might as well load them with the data that we need. Talk specifically about some test data challenges. Keeping test data in sync with the application, right? A lot of times we put data in our tests, we don't even think about it. It's almost subconscious, right? And then over time that data changes, either in the application, over time, or for whatever reason, it's someone else is in the environment mucking up our data, and it's not in sync. Similarly, at large integrated, kind of further down the pipeline, as we start to integrate systems together, keeping the data across those integrated systems in sync is a problem. And it all results, again, in the inability to reliably execute those tests on demand. If we can't do that, we might as well not automate them. So we alluded to it a little bit when we talked about the test suite canvas, right? And thinking about your test environment and your data management constraints, right? And so what we need to do, and before we create the test, is think about how we're going to manage the data for our specific test suite. In order to do that, though, we have to understand the data, right? We can't just wave a magic wand and automatically we've come up with some magic recipe to refresh our data back to some known state. We have to understand the details about it. The first piece is, what data do your tests require? That's pretty obvious, I hope. But again, sometimes subconsciously, we just add data to tests as we're creating them, and we completely forget about what's there after the fact. You have to understand what data is required. Once you understand that, you need to understand how it lives and behaves in the system, right? So I call that the dimensions of the data. You need to understand how that data behaves in your system. First dimension is type. Is it structured? Does it sit in a relational database? Or maybe it's unstructured. It's some type of marketing data feed from some third party. And this is obvious probably. The next one's value. Do I need a specific value for this test? Or maybe it's just a specific class of values, a specific account type or a specific SKU type to satisfy the objectives of the test. Time is a huge one. If you see, especially you have a suite of tests that seem to execute flawlessly over some period of time and then a handful of them start failing, typically time's the culprit. Something's expired. Maybe in its insurance policy that we're using as part of the test, its expiration date has passed. Maybe it's something as simple as passwords have expired. Right? And now the system is behaving differently because it's prompting you to change your password versus just go on with authentication. Reuse. You need to understand if the data that your test uses can be reused more than once, over and over again. Remember, these tests are going to need to be repeatable. Can they be reused? So I'm testing an e-commerce system. I probably can use the same account over and over again to create orders, but I probably can't use the same order if I'm testing shipping that order. Right? So it's those types of things you need to think about and address, again, before you create your automated test suite and before you're trying to get results. And finally, volume. Right? How much data do we need? This almost always comes into play for multi-user tests, for load tests. Right? I have some number of user accounts that I have to spread across my concurrent users. But I think there's some subtleties as well. There could be data values that represent volume, right? Some quantity of inventory that's required for a specific test to succeed. Or maybe it's some available credit that an account has that's required for a specific test objective. So once we understand our data and the dimensions of our data, we can start to think about a test data management strategy. But again, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Even for an organization implementing some e-commerce platform, the way they're going to manage their data compared to another organization implementing the same e-commerce platform is going to be completely different, right? The way the environments are organized, the way data is, who owns the data, where it is going to be completely different, right? So while I would love there to be the magic reset button that we could get to reset our data, in today's complex systems, it's just likely not going to happen. So it's much better that we develop a set of tools to put in our tool belt, so as these data situations arise, we're better equipped to deal with them. So I'm going to talk through some techniques. At the system or application level, yes, we have the tried and true data refresh. Again, with today's distributed complex systems, can we get to I press the button, I refresh my data? Probably not. A technique that is used often is data partitioning. So within an environment, we're cordoning off data to be used for a specific test suite. Maybe in a warehouse management system, we've dedicated a warehouse to a specific automated test suite. Maybe we've named some accounts such that it's obvious that they're used by a certain test suite. Right? You're kind of on your honor, right? In this, there's really no enforcement at a system level over not using this data, but at least gives people pause if they see, oh yeah, this is the automated integration test warehouse, or the automated integration one account. They maybe won't use it and won't change it underneath you, so it's ready for when you need it. Again, because we're treating our test environments more as cattle and not as pets, we can dedicate environments to specific test suites. Talked a little bit about that earlier. There's some things we can do at a test suite level. We can create the test that either a test suite or test needs as part of the pre-execution tasks. Similarly, we can clean up. We got to make sure, though, that the ratio of setup and effort, is not 10, 50, 100x in terms of the duration that it takes our test to run. We probably have a problem there, and there may be a better approach. Again, we can create our environments on demand, right? As part of the job that kicks off the test, you can also possibly create the environment and then maybe blow it away when we're done. There are some things that you can put into your test suite itself, into the framework to help out. We do this a lot for handling dynamic data, for that data that changes over time. Rather than put the actual values in our test, we'll put static placeholders in there and then map those to a central location that holds the current value. And then the framework just replaces whatever the current value is at runtime. So when that does change, at least I only have one place to go change that value and not everywhere that it might appear in my test suite. Finally, we have some external techniques. Right, we have the full-blown commercial test data management solutions. Does anyone use those? manages your environments, all the data in your environments. They're powerful, they're expensive. I don't see them in a lot of organizations, but if they support your technology, they can be effective. What I see more often is mocking and service virtualization, especially in upstream environments where components and integrated systems and third-party systems and applications just aren't there. They're just not available to us. Of course, that becomes less effective as we get further down the pipeline and we're looking for true end-to-end type tests. All right. So I want to wrap up with not too long discussion on things that certainly that we talked about, but also other things that you need to think about and take away, if nothing else, from this session. We talked earlier, you need to be effective with test automation if you want to achieve success in DevOps. Right? There's just no way that you can get the velocity and the efficiency that you need if you're not appropriately automating the tests and the checks that make sense to you. Within that, make sure you're thinking about what test suites are important, what test suites are adding value, and getting the right test in them. And we didn't talk about it earlier, but I think a good high-level filter is, if you're looking at a test suite and you can say to yourself, yes, I need all the information coming from the test in this test suite. That's a good indication you did a good job there. Conversely, maybe if you can ask yourself, am I comfortable with the information that this test suite is not giving me? If I can live with that, if I can live with that risk, you probably did a good job. Right? But if you have to answer the opposite to either of those two questions, you probably have a little work to do in the scope department. We just talked about environment and data. Again, if you do everything right, you've got the perfect approach, the perfect scope, the perfect tool. If you don't manage your environments, you don't manage your data, it's not going to matter because those tests aren't going to be able to be executed reliably on demand. It just won't matter. And we didn't talk about this directly, but certainly with the culture of DevOps, we have to continuously improve. Again, test automation should not be a fire and forget solution. You're going to find better ways to determine your scope, better ways to manage your environments, better ways to manage your data. You're going to find a more effective way to execute your test, maybe a more effective tool, a more effective framework. You need to allow and allocate time for continuous improvement. There's going to be tests that become obsolete, tests that just, for whatever reason, can't be executed reliably. They're constantly flaky. You need to fix them or you need to remove them. Right? So again, very common for me to see this automated test suite that just takes on a life of its own. It's created, maybe it's enhanced, but there's never any thought to how you can make it better. And it just exists and exists and exists until it just doesn't add any value anymore, and it gets dumped. So continuously improve, that's very important. And finally, notice that we didn't talk at all about, at least from a test automation perspective, specific tools. It is way too common for someone to come in an organization, hey, we need automation. Okay, I've got this automation engineer. We're going to pull this person in. And they bring whatever they've done in the past, this tool or this approach. And then that's their hammer, and anything you have that possibly be automated becomes their nail. This should not be a tool-first discussion. Tool is step 5, step 6, right? We're doing the things, understanding what test suites are important, what risks we need mitigated, what tests need to go in those test suites. We're getting all the foundational things, the test environment and the test data in line first. And then we're looking at the things we need to be automated and seeing what tools we need to acquire or we need to build, perhaps, to make those things happen. Right? Test automation is not just Selenium. It's not just SOAP UI, or it's not just Rest Assured library. Right? It could be any of those, certainly, and a combination of those, but we shouldn't be starting there. So that's all I have. I love talking about this stuff. If you guys have any questions or follow-on questions, feel free to hit me up either anytime today or via any of those methods after the show. I thank you all for coming, and of course, thank the organizers who put on a great program. So, and please fill out the feedback forms. It's important to the organizers as well as me. So, thank you.